Welcome back, everybody. And welcome back, who's ever in cyberspace tuning in. We're back to chapter 9 of the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's been a while, so I thought tonight I would just begin reading down to what we're going to cover tonight, just to give us the background. And we tentatively changed the title from Light Enlightenment to Luminous Awakening. Everybody don't need to remember that, but that's okay. And I think we'll go right to about page 9, starting, so slowly reading it. At that time, from the wheels of the bottoms of the world under one's feet were released 1 billion bright lights which illumined the 3,000 great thousand worlds. They also illumined 1 billion Jambudvipas, 1 billion Puravidayas, 1 billion Aparagonaniyas, and 1 billion Uttarakarus. They illumined 1 billion great oceans, 1 billion winged green mountains, 1 billion bodhisattvas being born, 1 billion bodhisattvas leaving home, 1 billion thus come ones accomplishing proper enlightenment, 1 billion thus come ones turning the Dharma wheel, and 1 billion thus come ones entering nirvana. Also, 1 billion Sumeru kings of mountains, 1 billion heavens of the 4 kings, 1 billion heavens of the 33, 1 billion Suyama heavens, 1 billion Tushita heavens, 1 billion bliss from transformation heavens, 1 billion heavens of comfort gained from others' transformations, 1 billion heavens of the Brahma multitudes, 1 billion light sound heavens, 1 billion heavens of pervasive purity, 1 billion vast result heavens, and 1 billion ultimate form heavens. All of these were clearly revealed within this light. Just as in this place one could see the Buddha, the world honor, once seated on his lotus flower treasury lion's throne, with bodhisattvas as many as fine motes of dust, and 10 Buddha lands circumambulating him, so too in each of the 1 billion Jambudvipas, the 1 billion thus come ones were also seated in the same way. And because of the spiritual power of the Buddha, in each of the 10 directions was a great bodhisattva, who together with the bodhisattvas to numbers of fine motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands came to the Buddha's place. And now we're entering a new section. I believe we're going into the names of the bodhisattvas. Their names were Manjushri Bodhisattva, Awakened Leader Bodhisattva, Wealthy Leader Bodhisattva, Jeweled Leader Bodhisattva, Merit and Virtue Leader Bodhisattva, Vision Leader Bodhisattva, Vigorous Leader Bodhisattva, Dharma Leader Bodhisattva, Wisdom Leader Bodhisattva, and Worthy Leader Bodhisattva. These bodhisattvas all came from their own countries, that is to say, the golden colored world, the wondrous colored world, the lotus flower colored world, Kampaka or Champaka flowered colored world, Utpala flower colored world, golden colored world, jeweled colored world, the Vajra colored world, the crystal colored world, and the equally colored, sameness colored world. In the presence of the Buddhas, all these bodhisattvas cultivated Brahma conduct, specifically a moving wisdom Buddha, unobstructive wisdom Buddha, liberation wisdom Buddha, awesome deportment wisdom Buddha, understanding characteristics or appearances wisdom Bodhisattva, ultimate wisdom Bodhisattva, superior wisdom Bodhisattva, comfortable wisdom Bodhisattva, Brahma wisdom Buddha, and contemplating and investigating wisdom Buddha. Okay, as I would go through this, and you can ask about this, but sometimes I've translated a little differently just in the process of doing this. Change wonderful to wondrous. These are choices, I guess, in language. I always think of wonderful and associate it with this program my parents used to watch in the 50s, Lawrence Welk Show. And he would come on and say, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And it was really lightweight, pinkish, champagne bubbles, and just too Pollyannish for me. Kind of a maudlin. If you want to, I'm sure it's still running on YouTube or something. You want to take a look and you'll see the wonderful, wonderful. So I prefer wondrous. I think it has a more, actually more adorned and more grounded, if you can, for wonder. But this quality of wonder is also brought out as one of the essentials for one's own cultivation. And it's not just curiosity, but it's a sense of awe and inspiration that comes from a kind of direct encounter with things of a spiritual nature, both within and without. And often, because these things are so deep and so part of our nature, when they arise, they evoke wonder. They don't necessarily have a black and white answer quality about them. They're both elevating and a little bit maybe intimidating sometimes, or inexplicable, mysterious, and yet they're very real. And wonder is an appropriate response in these situations, because it doesn't close the door, it keeps you open to what might come next. And one of the texts say, from wonder to wonder, one's life opens. From wonder to wonder, existence opens. And it's meant to convey that, for the most part, in our ordinary mind and consciousness, we don't live in the wonders. We collapse that wonders down to something very quotidian and mundane, and sometimes even sorry. In the Hobbesian sense, where he says he collapses the wonder down to life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's a collapsing of wonder down to something that's less than wondrous. But if you tap into this, begin to tap into this, it isn't to say it's mystical and far out. I don't want to imply that, or it's lights and colors and, carnival-like esoteric states. But rather, it's something that's actually very quiet and deep. A joy, a somewhat of an awe, and an openness to what's real yet unexpected. Anyhow, that's wondrous. I didn't like wonderful. I think I did another. I changed enlightenment to awakening. And again, this is my preference for INGs over EDs. EDs, to me, convey a kind of fixed and settled, enlightened. Did you get enlightened? As if it were a prize or a trophy or winning the lottery. But awakening has to do with an ongoing, evolving, unfolding, again, tying into the wondrous. Moreover, if you look at the Platform Sutra, you'll see the Sixth Patriarch defines it more along the lines of a continuous application of mindfulness and effort and purity into one's daily life. That awakening is something that's ongoing, that you do moment to moment, thought to thought. It's not a done deal, it's not a one-time accomplishment. So I prefer awakening rather than enlightened. Anything else? I don't even remember. Those are the two I remember I shifted. And of course, luminous awakening. Oh yes, and the other one, which I really, where is this? The character Xian. Yes, page 9. We have where does this appear? The cheerful Mingjiang. Where's the Marx? I've got it here as understanding Marx wisdom. Yeah.
The second paragraph, line 5.
Uh-huh.
Understanding Marx.
I'm looking at, oh, there it is. It's a second to last line in the middle paragraph under, let's see what that, Ming Xiang Zhi Fu, literally. And Ming is pictorially the sun and the moon. If you look at that character, for those of, this is how I sort of remember characters, whether it's accurate. If you're looking at that in the Chinese, on the left-hand side, it's the second to the bottom, Ming Xiang Zhi Fu. And the Ming is bright, or can be an awakening or understanding. And then the Xiang literally is what they translate as marks. And then Zhi is Zhi-weighted Zhi, I take it to be wisdom and Buddha. So understanding marks, wisdom, Buddha, I don't know, doesn't that fall a little flat for you? Understanding marks. I mean, I don't mean to be facetious, but sometimes it sounds like someone who can track, through the wilderness. You understand the marks and the signs, and so you're a tracker. This isn't one, and yet we've struggled over the years. We've struggled diligently to render this into something that's comprehensible. Anybody takes on that? Who knows the Chinese? Even if you know the Chinese and you say, yeah, it means marks. Well, what does that really mean in kind of engaged cultivation language? What does it mean to understand marks? The wisdom of understanding marks. And I'm glad for people who are listening to this online, it is M-A-R-K-S. Okay, it's not Groucho nor Carl. Okay?
Is it like literate?
Like literate? Mm-hmm. Meaning?
Like literate, like understanding the wisdom.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Understanding like written words. Mm-hmm. Usually it's not associated with that, but that is within the purview of a bodhisattva's cultivation, is to understand and to have mastery of the various forms of expression of living beings, not just humans, which would include why you would begin to study foreign languages, why you would study the language of art and music, why you would study the language of dreams. These are all, in a sense, marks in that of people conveying through symbols their thoughts and feelings and emotions, which is the ground on which bodhisattvas work to liberate. So if you don't understand those and you don't have access to those, you can't really serve as a therapeutic guide or mentor to people. Anybody else on marks? Yes.
What about looking past appearances or awareness of the superficial?
That I think is also probably even closer. The idea of marks has to do with the appearance of things, as things appear, characteristics rather than, And so the wisdom that comes from seeing past the surface of things, or seeing that characteristics and appearances are not always what they seem. They're a little bit of some presentation and a lot of bit of our interpretation. And so getting to see past what appears to be. It also has the meaning of not being moved by appearances, by sights and sounds and smells and so forth, so that you have a kind of aplomb or a kind of equanimity that the superficials of the sensory objects don't move you. So it's got that. Okay, those are the ones I worked on. I don't know if there was any more.
Can I ask about one more?
Oh, yes.
I was curious about the wealthy leader bodhisattva, I think it was. I'm guessing that's not dollar wealth?
Wealthy leader, where is that? So we have, on bottom of page 6, you have Qi Mingye. Their names were Wanshu Shirli Pusa, that's Manjushri. And then you have Juesho Pusa, that's enlightened. And then you have Tsai Sho. Anybody want to render the translation of Tsai Sho? You have Sho in all of them, right? Meaning?
Leader.
Huh?
Leader.
Leader.
Sometimes foremost.
Huh? A little louder, please.
Sometimes like foremost. Like the number one.
Instead of leader, foremost?
I mean, another meaning of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like the foremost in spiritual power, the foremost in this or that.
Mm-hmm. Leader's okay. It assumes followers. And these qualities would, if you look at them, again, as we unpack this, these qualities of character could stimulate people to follow, to imitate. So that's one of the meanings. Anybody want to render tsai into something wealthy? Or interpret it, please? Come on, let's not be shy. You all have opinions about this.
During Chinese New Year,
Huh?
people always say, "Gong Xi Fa Cai."
Oh, Gung Chi Fa Cai. Okay, so that's,
This is the Cai.
this is the Cai. Did you know what he just said? Happy New Year. See, some people know that. What's the Mandarin? It's not Gung Chi Fa Cai, but
It's, I wish you get wealthy.
Xing Li Kuai Le, right?
No. Gong Xi, congratulations, I hope you get rich. That's that kind of thing.
Okay, so this was a very wealthy and rich bodhisattva. Now, on the face of it, it wouldn't seem like that would be consistent with all the other qualities here, having vision, vigorous Dharma leader, awakened, and then filthy rich. So, yes.
I don't, personally, I would actually suggest that wealthy might actually be very apt for that.
You'd what?
I think wealthy is fine.
Uh-huh.
I mean, rethink filthy rich.
Hmm.
But this is someone who's like unfilthy rich. He actually uses wealth for very worthwhile purposes. That's why he's a leader.
Okay, so again, here the interpretation would be there's nothing wrong being wealthy. The right or wrong of it might depend on what you do with the wealth. Okay? And that doesn't mean you wisely invest it necessarily, but okay. Anybody else on wealthy? Yes.
There's two ways of being wealthy. One is to accumulate a lot. The other is to be satisfied with what you have.
Mm-hmm. And so it could be that he is actually in the fullness of enough. That wealth could be enoughness. Yes.
Be abundantly wealthy and give away generously.
That's a lot out of one character, but I'm all for interpretation, but that's yeah. It's basically just one who's foremost in Tsai. So again, but you see in this text and other Buddhist texts, the very notion of wealth can be material, and it can be an asset and a tool of cultivation. With great wealth, you can do great benefit if you bestow it properly. I was thinking of this little girl who saw, and I don't know where it was just recently, she's like in kindergarten, and she saw that kids in her school and other schools were not able to have their lunch because their family were in arrears and paying for their lunch at school. And so they couldn't eat lunch. And she thought this was absolutely horrible. So she convinced her mother to have some kind of little bake or toy sale with which they would bake things and then sell them and use the money to pay off the debt of the other children so they could have lunch. And it's like, whoa, so there's wealthy leader, okay, in kindergarten. And not only did she pay off the $3,000 or something in the school, it kept going, and she paid off the whole damn district. It was like in $20,000 or $30,000 just from this one idea. And it wasn't to get wealth for herself, but to distribute it. So these are things where, you look at them and say, wealthy leader Bodhisattva, I can't find him. Well, she's in kindergarten, okay? You're not just looking in the right place. So yeah, okay. I don't know if that answers your question. Good. All right. Let's move on a little bit. I was saying I'm trying to use a technique for retrieving meaning that presents itself through the text, through kind of interpretation of the text, both from examples given, say, in commentary, but also our own, and more importantly, our own experience. And the story I just used was an example of how my teacher would illustrate the closeness of this language, the closeness of these virtues to our everyday life, and not see them as distant and only bodhisattvas. Before, in the classes previous last semester, I was suggesting that this exercise of retrieving meaning, pulling out the meaning or the meanings of a text like this that's very, very old and sometimes difficult to access, involves necessarily language. We just did a little language here with the Chinese. There's other times where the Sanskrit will be helpful. Maybe tonight we'll get into some of that. And so having language skills is really a good thing to have in retrieving meaning. But there's a side personally that has to do with not only do you try to figure out what the text means, you also return the light and try to figure out what you need to do or what I need to do in order to let the meaning come out, approach me. And I mentioned last time there were three things, and I just wanted to just review them a little bit. The one is what we call trishna, which is literally thirst or excessive desires, cravings. These basically act as cataracts over the eyes that would retrieve meaning from the text. The meaning bounces off of us because we're so focused on acquiring, getting, indulging, that it isn't available, as one of the texts said. With that as your ground, you only see the surface of things. You see the shang, the appearances. You don't see the depth. The other one we talked about was hubris, or pride or arrogance as being another block. Here, it has to do with the sense that I already have it, I already know it, I'm knowledgeable and smart, and if there's a problem, it's because the text is obscure or confused. It's not about me. And so that hubris has to do visually almost like you're so full there's no place for anything to enter, full of oneself. And that can be personal or it can be cultural. It can be big or it can be small. It can be just like little petty venalities you hang on to about yourself and your ego, or it can be huge. It can be megalomania and just rampantly out there. And I promise I'm not going to do any sub-commentaries or anything, try to refrain myself. So it can be, it's centric. It means centered. It could be culturally centered, that you see things only through the lens of your culture and what your culture offers you and hides from you. You have, for example, if your culture is one of we are exceptional, we're the best, then that's the lens with which you see other things. And everything is then evaluated through your primacy of your presumed exceptionalism. It could be anthropocentric. In other words, it's all seen through the eyes of the human, that the human is the measure of all things. Therefore, when it talks about these bodhisattvas and Buddhas in these different lands, they go, blah, blah, it's not within my reach in the human. So human becomes a focus that we can see things somewhat clearly, and it also becomes a closing off of possibilities. It can be ethnic-centric. It could be that my ethnicity or my tribe or my clan or whatever has access to the way things really are, and everybody is outside of there. We are the center of the universe. It could be egocentric. It's like, well, forget the tribe, forget the culture, it's all about me. I am. And that's another centric hubris. And I think I would add too, although maybe someone object, I think there's a sort of species-centric thing that can occur too, where we're not ego, we're not cultural, but we see the human species as the primary living being, organizing, dominant force. And therefore, we overlook other species, or we denigrate them, or we manipulate and use them to our pleasure or our purposes. And even the natural world itself, we relegate to a secondary status. And these are all centric around hubris. The other one I was talking about, we didn't get into a lot, but it was the idea of, and this I think comes also from the Sixth Patriarch Sutra. Gosh, I mean, all of the teachings, if you look at the biographies and autobiographies of monks and nuns and cultivators throughout time, all of them talk about the danger of disembodied study and practice. In other words, disembodied means not taking it into your whole being as a serious and sincere way of living. It becomes either an external study that you master as a field of knowledge almost, or as a discipline, but you're not truly sincerely immersed in it as if it's food that you eat to sustain your life and your body. This can often lead to what is called koto-chan. I don't know if you've ever heard this expression. Literally, ko is mouth, to is head, mouth, chan, blah, 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 blah. You know, writing verses about your awakening, you know, over espresso coffee and a cigar, discussing the intricacies of meditation, blah, blah, blah. It can also turn into sophistry and a kind of argumentative intelligence or debate, and even showing off, which the Buddha clearly warned throughout all his practices not to use the Dharma for debate and argumentative and winning and losing. He said, basically, it's like grabbing a poisonous snake at the wrong end. It'll bite you. And this is from an actual sutta that talks about this. And so that can be one form of it taking, and it could be that you don't show off. You just sort of have an accumulation of knowledge that you just rest with, but you don't actually think of applying it. You don't actually think of transforming yourself according to it, but it's there and you're here. But there's another part. That's the study part of it becoming sterile because it's not applied. But the other part is the study practice. The practice disembodiment is a little more difficult to get at because you can be, quote, practicing, but it's disembodied. Does that make any sense to people? Disembodied practice? You know, disembodied study, you can kind of get. It's just pure abstraction and kind of speculative philosophy and so forth. But disembodied practice? It's basically just going through the motions. You're doing it. You're coming to the temple, you're doing the bowing, the lighting of incense, you're making offerings, you're even doing the ceremonies and rituals. But it's either sort of perfunctory, just sort of going through the motions. At certain holidays or certain crises in your life, you come and do that. Or it has behind it something else that I would say is sort of unhealthy seeking, wanting favors and sort of negotiating with the deities, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I'll do this if you give me that. And also can lean into magic, that you expect a return from certain acts, right? And it's almost like if I say this special mantra and move the stick in that way, magic will happen and I didn't, do it quite right. All of this I can think is kind of disembodied practice. And by disembodied, I mean it's not cultivated on your own mind ground. You're not using the practices to transform yourself, but rather to sort of externalize. There's an actual view of the wrong views in Dristi in the text that talks about this somewhat, that relates to this, and it's called Shilavatra Paramarsa. That's the Sanskrit. And basically, it's a view that has attachments to rites and rituals, clinging to disciplinary codes or modes of conduct, rites and rituals that you esteem in and of themselves as leading to liberation. You think that holding to these, clinging to these, really doing these in a very ritualistic, proper way, in and of itself will be liberating and efficacious to your awakening and to your own liberation. And this is actually considered a wrong view because you're holding as cause and you're taking as a path something that isn't a path. So this is tricky. Does that make sense to anybody? I mean, is that clear? So I'm not making that term up. That's an actual term. It doesn't mean, and to be very clear, it's an attachment to these religious vows and observances And then you think of them, you mistakenly think them to leading to awakening. Often it's associated with a mistaken asceticism. For example, fasting to the extreme, mortifying the flesh through, the classic sleeping on a bed of nails or something, or flagellation, self-flagellation, these kinds of things. And mistaking that for the path of purification. Now, the thing about this is it doesn't mean that you should not perform rituals and do devotions and do the ceremonies and hold the precepts. That's not what this means. It's not about them and themselves, but it's the mind with which you do them, that you give over to them a magical, externalized power independent of your own self-cultivation. And that's why the texts talk about that there can be responses and transformation occurring through these rites and rituals, devotions, if the person performing them is very sincere. And by sincere means don't like, I really want it. But sincere means you're actually purifying yourself. You're using, in fact, the ceremonies and rituals as an exercise in Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna while you're doing them. So you're immersing yourself in them with an almost mind that isn't thinking about anything else. The Avamtasaka Sutra says, Ishin Bulan, one mind untarnished, unconfused. That's how you're doing it. And then, what the Avatamsaka says, this is called the stimulus of potentials. The stimulus of potentials. Your potentials are the stimulus that bring on this. It's not brought on just by the efficaciousness of the ritual per se or the devotion, but the interchange between your sincerity and whatever those other forces or powers are that work. And at that point, it's said they become two, not one. So when you recite, for example, to the ultimate point where your one mind is unconfused, you're that way, then the Buddha that you're reciting and the Buddha within unite and become one. They're not two. So this is a very, very important thing to get at. Anyhow, so anything on that? This is why, remember the sixth patriarch, he said, good and wise friends, people chant prajna all day long. Chanting all day long without realizing the prajna of their own essential nature. So that's his point. Just as talking about, I'm quoting you from the text, just as talking about food will not satisfy hunger, so too only talking about prajna and emptiness, even for myriad of eons, will give you no insight into your own nature. Ultimately, it is of no benefit. So here he's criticizing not the reciting, but reciting without internalizing. And to be clear, he says, the mind has a capacity for great things. It's not meant to behave in petty ways. Do not talk about emptiness all day long, but fail to cultivate it in your minds. That would be like a commoner proclaiming himself to be king of the country. I promised I wouldn't do anything. I won't. How absurd could this could never be. I'm exerting people to realize the Buddha knowledge and vision within their own minds, but ordinary people are perverse, confused, deluded, and they go wrong. Their talk may be good, but their minds are bad. The ritual might be performed exactly, but the mind behind it is off. I've added that contextually. Therefore, they're greedy, they're hateful, envious, fawning, flattering, deceitful, and arrogant, and they take advantage of others and harm living creatures, all the while reciting prajna, 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 prajna. So he's pointing to a kind of what we might call hypocrisy, but on a more functional level, he's saying if your mind is not actually cultivating clarity and goodness and precepts and so forth, the efficaciousness is in that mind that results, not in the act itself. So body and mind, emotion and intellect, intention and action have to be fused in order for there to be an efficacious response. Anyhow, I will move on, but that's sort of where we got to in the last part, and now we're moving into. And I'm not going to try to do every line. I don't myself even pretend to begin to understand it. I'm only going to select out things that I feel I can say something about that I might have a little grasp of. And that's just the nature of this text. I don't know that one could exhaust it, and if one could exhaust it, you would be one of these Buddhas. And I wanted to say a little bit. It says in the text, all of these bodhisattvas, and see what page that is. Yes, on page 9. In the presence of the Buddhas, all these bodhisattvas cultivate Brahma conduct. And then it goes into these names. So here, tonight, I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to suggest two things. I want to talk a little bit about the Brahma conduct part. But when we do hermeneutics, which are getting at the criteria and methods and principles you use for interpreting text, one tool that my teacher has always said, do not think that this text has nothing to do with you. It does have a lot to do with you. It was spoken for people. And so hidden in here, one of the hermeneutic tools we can use for getting at some of the meanings is to actually take the names. So these names, and we just did wealthy as one, and gave an example, but you use the names because the text itself in these names hold clues to how we might see or hear or know differently than we do. In other words, how to increase and nurture our light. So the names of the bodhisattvas describe the cultivation, the training that's required for direct knowing and seeing. And not just about them, but it's about us. So these qualities, these names, this isn't Mary and John and Harry and, Jong R and Song. This is really describing either the qualities they cultivated to reach their awakening or the qualities that they manifested upon their awakening, the virtues and lights that they, in their character, that were illumined. So in a sense for us, when we look at this, when we say liberation, wisdom, awesome deportment, it's not just talking about them, but it's talking about qualities that we could cultivate. What am I doing with my body, mouth, and mind as I move through the world? How do I stand? How do I present myself? Is my very posture, the way I use my eyes and my mouth, creating a better world, or is it messing things up? This is called deportment. Deportment, without even speaking, is a way of speaking, right? And you can think of people that you see who conduct and carry themselves in such ways that you are actually moved. Sometimes you're moved to humor and tears. You're moved to tears, or you're moved to derision. You're thrown off, or you're inspired by the very presence of how they carry themselves, how they use their eyes, what they look at as you observe them. So I'm suggesting here that the names then can serve as hermeneutic tools for us to return and say, this is about us. These are qualities that we could nurture. So that was, and I will go into this next week. I want to talk about some of these names, but also they all cultivated Brahma conduct. And in that way, to say a little about Brahma conduct, in Buddhist texts, this usually refers to, in Buddhist texts, now this is a word obviously that's in throughout what's been called the Hindu tradition. I don't like that word, but I say it because you kind of know what I'm talking about. That was not necessarily, I don't know where it came from. It came from Indus Valley, and it was the name that outsiders, particularly the British, referred to everything that wasn't Buddhist or Christian. So this was called, they lived there in the Indus Valley, they were Hindus. And so all the religious spiritual traditions got grouped under Hindu. Okay, so, yeah. Okay. Anyhow, in the Buddhist sense, it usually refers to what we would call brahmacharya. Brahmacharya. Charya meaning, I guess, conduct, or, yeah. So Brahma conduct, small b, not referring necessarily to the Brahma heavens or to the deity associated as Brahman, but this is referring to brahmacharya. Now, sometimes this is just straight out celibacy. This is a practice that's taken up by monks and nuns who take vows of celibacy, and it's considered brahmacharya. It also is associated with the holy life in a more general sense, and sometimes the key ingredients of brahmacharya in the Buddhist sense have to do with what's called the 4 Brahma Viharas. These key elements. Anybody know what the 4 Brahma Viharas are? Anybody know the Chinese for that? The 4 unlimited minds? Come on. Well, not what they are, but the 4. 4, 无, what's limit? 四无量心, right? Okay, that's the Chinese. Brahma Viharas are, okay, now what are they? Are you going to do them Chinese or Sanskrit or English?
What do you
Let's start with Sanskrit.
Okay.
Metta,
Karuna,
Karuna,
Mudita,
Mudita,
and Upeksha.
Upekkha. Okay,
Upeksha.
Upeksha. Okay, Chinese,
Tsu, Pei,
Shi,
Sha.
Shi. English, loving kindness or kindness, loving kindness, metta, karuna, compassion, mudita. It's like sympathetic joy. It's not just joy, but it's sympathetic joy. Specifically, you're really turned on and happy because somebody else is doing well. Oh, I thought it was my joy when everybody says happy birthday. I go, oh, I'm filled with joy. No, you see someone whose birthday is happening and you see their happiness and you're sympathetic to it. This is really interesting. It's the opposite of envy and jealousy. Yeah. Okay, and then the last one, equanimity. It means basically in all situations, you see all conditioned dharmas as dreams, illusions, bubble, shadows, and you maintain your center and your balance. You don't tip to either side. These are the 4. So they cultivated this conduct. I'll just tell a brief story about it, because it's nice to have stories every once in a while. And I promised you I would tell stories as we go along, because it's one of my ways of understanding these in a very existential sense as opposed to abstract. So, and some of you have heard the story, so you can zone out, but don't turn your phones on or do Google and text right now. Just pretend you're listening. So when Heng Sure and I began our bowing pilgrimage, I was the Dharma protector, and he was the vow maker. And at first I thought, well, he'll bow and I'll take care of everything. And then I found out, no, the idea was I bow too, besides taking care of everything. So, yeah, anyhow, I ended up doing a lot of bowing. But also I had to take care of the food, the shelter, the logistics, talking to people because he had a vow of silence and so forth. So being a Dharma protector, I thought, okay, so we're going to start on the mean streets of LA with his pilgrimage and work our way up. Even back then in the 1977, California was fraught with, how should we say it, difficulties, threats, challenges, and anyhow. And so I thought, well, at that time I had my black belt in martial arts, but besides that, I probably should take some weapon along just to protect Heng Sure. So at that time we started, we had a little cart that a disciple had made, a wooden cart on wheels, and so I'd wheel the cart inside with his sleeping bags and cooking gear and whatnot. We didn't end up keeping that because it was absurd to think that we were going to sleep out on the streets of LA. But that's what we thought. In any event, a little worried about that, I had hidden an axe in that cart. And it wasn't just to chop wood, it was to chop off the heads of the baddies that would attack Heng Sure, in case my martial arts skills weren't enough. And so, but I didn't tell Heng Sure about that, I didn't tell anybody about it, I just snuck it in between the sleeping bag and whatnot. And as we're going out the door to begin the pilgrimage at the temple, the master's sitting there just like this, and he's saying, Go Tang, I said, Sure Fu. What? Give it to me. What? The axe. The axe? What axe? The axe that's in your cart. Oh, that axe. And Heng Sure's going, You got an axe? I said, Yeah, I'm going to protect you. And so I begrudgingly handed the axe over to the master, and he said, if you were to use something like this, a weapon on this pilgrimage, you would no longer be a Buddhist. And he said, even if you allow your temper and anger to rise and get the best of you, I won't consider you my disciple. Whoa. So it was really strong. So not only not using the axe, but even the anger and violent thoughts that would precede using it, I couldn't. So I said, well, how am I going to protect Heng Sure and myself? Because not everybody out there, sure, like I'm telling him something, not everybody out there is a bodhisattva. And he's very patient. He says, I will give you a secret dharma that you can use. Oh. So at that time, the hot movie on television was Kung Fu, and it showed this young kid who was studying with the Shaolin monks, and his name was Grasshopper. And the old monk would say, now, Grasshopper, it's time to learn Iron Fist. And then he would teach him this and that. And so I'm thinking, okay, now this great master is going to teach me the secret. And I said, what are they? And he said, they are called the Four Unlimited Minds, which of course I took to be a kind of euphemistic expression for, white tiger climbs mountain or something, which is some kind of martial arts move. And I said, oh, okay, Heng Sure, translate it. Heng Sure said, well, it's kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. I said, yeah, but what do they mean? Is one a punch and the other one a kick? And the master just finds this really amusing. He says, no, this is your weapon. This is what you use. This is the only weapon I'm permitting you to use. Any situation you encounter, you must respond with either loving kindness or compassion or sympathetic joy or equanimity. One or all, depending on the situation. And I'm saying, that's it? And he said, that's more than enough. He said, why do you think they're called unlimited? Oh, well, I tell you, I did not go out kind of bolstered with a sense of confidence. I felt even more vulnerable than before. So, going ahead a little bit, the actual application of these was quite surprising. Down the road, as we were bound through the Big Sur area, and those of you who have been in Big Sur knows that it's a very narrow ribbon of highway along very steep cliffs. And so often all we had in terms of space was maybe the width of two of these narrow rugs here between the highway and the cliff dropping off. So I'd find a place to park the car, and then we'd sit down and have our lunch there. And then after the lunch, Heng Sure would go back to bowing, and I would do the dishes on the back of this old Plymouth wagon that we were using. And on this particular day, I was in the back cleaning up and doing the dishes, and this red Jeep pulls up alongside. Now, Big Sur at this, generally is very remote and very isolated, and there's not a lot of people. And even if there are people, nobody really stops because there's no place really to stop. So people are usually going through or going to some resort or something like that. So the Jeep stopped, and there was this pretty tough-looking character inside, and I didn't make much of it because sometimes people stopped to make offerings or to ask what we were doing. And I looked up, and I'm saying the distance now between him and me, with him and his Jeep, is between you and me here. It's very close. He's right on the highway, and I'm right on the edge. And he looks at me, and his face turns. It gives a really weird look. It wasn't like, I like you. It was more like, what the? And I look at him, he looks at me, and then he reaches between a seat, and he pulls a .45 caliber handgun. And I know enough about guns to know what this is, and that's not to be trifled with. And I look at him, he looks at me, and he takes a .45, and he lowers it and pulls the trigger and aims it at my head. And Heng Sure is way beyond doing anything. There's nobody else around, and there I am. And so in those situations, psychologists talk about flight, fight, or freeze. And so I'm saying, okay, flight, where am I going to fly to? If I could fly, I'd jump off the cliff, but it's 100-some feet down, so that's not an option. Fighting is not an option, one, because I was told I couldn't, and then secondly, because the distance between him and me, no matter how good I am, I'm not going to close that distance before the slug goes through me. And then freezing didn't seem to be very much of an option because it was sort of like I'm just there frozen. So I'm going blah, 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 and I'm thinking, okay, there's a fourth possibility, which I just invented, which I call focus. So there's flight, freeze, or focus, or I would call four, which is the four unlimited minds. So I'm thinking, I have to do something. It can't be aggressive. It can't be even aggressive thought. What am I going to do? And almost impulsively, it came to me afterwards. I thought about there probably was some reason for doing this in terms of something in a rapport. But all I did was to put my palms together like this and look him in the eye and just bow down to him like that. And immediately his face changed. It softened. And he looked at me for a long time, just looking at me, and then he let the cocked, the hammer. That was a sweet sound, I'll tell you. That uncocked. And he put it back between, he went, and then drove off. And I'm thinking, that was an application in my own way of the Brahma Vihara, a kind of equanimity, a kind of loving kindness, a kind of non-aggression. I don't know, the sympathetic joy was quite there. Maybe that wasn't the one. I felt joy afterwards. I hope he did too. But I realized that although these are presented as bodhisattva kind of elevated practices, in a very real sense, and I say this in a very real sense, it actually worked for me. It actually worked in that situation. And I found again many times, a number of times, things like this happen on the pilgrimage. And truly, if one takes them up, and I don't want to be naive here, and I'm just saying, if you really take them up and embody them, you'd be surprised how actually powerful they can be in many situations. Even the simplest situation of dealing with a conflictual family situation where there's tension. Instead of generating, I'm going to get even, or I'm quid pro quo, going to do this or that, you just sort of ease up a little bit and enter into these things. It's amazing because even though you don't know how, somehow it radiates and has a corresponding effect in somebody else. The opposite would be true, and I think if you respond with unkindness or hostility, you respond with alienation and distancing yourself. If you respond with jealousy and envy, and also just getting really upset, that will also trigger a corresponding, even though it may not have been there to begin with. So I just bring up the Brahma conduct or the Brahma Viharas tonight as an example. Next week we'll go into the names and go from there. Okay. Questions? Comments? Going on? I didn't tell that story before? Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I'm around to tell you that story. Yeah, it sounds funny when you hear, but if you actually are on a highway like that alone, and a .45 caliber handgun is aimed at your head, I grew up around people who used these guns. My cousin had these guns. It's a really powerful gun. And at that range, it would have totally, and so, I mean, you're it's not like, officer, help me. There's nobody there. There's nobody there. It's just you and that person, and you never met them before, but you know they got something. And so, I don't know, it's like...
I wonder why he put the gun down, because maybe your gesture, angelic gesture?
It wasn't just, see, here's the thing. The gesture had something to do with it, and I found that bowing, generally, but bowing to others, really disarms.
It made him sort of remember that quality in himself.
It could, but I must emphasize that from my teacher's thing, it wasn't just bowing, but it was the heart with which the bow was done. Just a simple gesture like this may or may not have had that. Partly I was really afraid, but partly I was also unafraid, knowing that if I did something really sincere that I had been doing week after week here with sincerity, was the only shot I had. I heard you say that. It was the only chance I had to reverse that situation. all my martial arts skills at that point were useless. And all external help was useless. It was just that. So anyways, I'm sorry, yes.
A thought came into my mind when you told us about this story, is that I wonder if that was Venerable Master test you. And secondly, I wonder if
He didn't look like the Venerable Master testing me.
and then did you tell this story to the Venerable Master?
I'll have to look back at my journals. Surely, yeah, this was the story I would have told him. All I can remember him saying, it really wasn't like the master, whatever you think his abilities were, to do these kinds of tests on his disciples. I think what he might have said, he did say at the time was, didn't I tell you that this would be what you could use in all situations? But I think he was actually telling this because from his own experience, he knew that these qualities of mind are very, very powerful. We don't use them enough. We don't use these 4 Brahma Viharas enough. They truly are inexhaustible. So,
Sorry, did you think this guy might stop up ahead, with Heng Sure up ahead bound? Was that a concern?
I hadn't thought about, I should have said, hey, I'm sure, 4 Brahma Viharas! I think he may have seen Heng Sure first. And then was going to maybe go and turn around and then saw me, and I looked as weird as Heng Sure, shaved head and whatnot, so I figured these two guys, they had to be together. And I think he was expressing something. I can't even get into what that was, whether this was a karmic debt from the past, whether it was a test. I'd like to think, it was the Brahma heaven God testing me. And after he put it, he turned into a deva and ascended. No, he just drove off in his Jeep. So I didn't get to say, that was that going on there. Anyhow, I'm glad I'm here to tell you the story. Given the alternatives. Do we have some announcements or?
Stacy, right? Has some.
Yes?
What you say?
No, I said, again, YCA has a Buddha recitation tomorrow, or on Sunday, so if people want to join, there's one day reciting the Buddha's name. And tomorrow is just our regular Saturday activities.
So there's a recitation tomorrow from when to when?
Oh, Sunday.
Sunday.
From 8, usually it starts from about 8 o'clock to about 4:30 p.m.
Okay.
So, and then there's our regular Saturday program.
Lecture tomorrow night.
On the Avatamsaka Sutra as well.
I'm sure he's going to be from Australia.
Yep. We're all in the 10th round.
Okay. Any other announcement? Retreats coming up? Classes?
We do have the Guanyin retreat coming up in March. And people have seen the poster outside. There's the Living the Practice with Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's coming to teach Abhidharma. So if you want a very systematic approach to your mind, you can't get better than the Abhidharma. Maybe the Yogacara.
And Stephen Turner teaching Yogacara on Wednesdays.
Oh, you see Yogacara?
Yes, 7:30.
Oh, wow. I have to say, we have a lot of Yogacara outside. If you don't know what that is, it's like it's a Mahayana version of Abhidharma.
I'd like to see you give a 1-sentence definition. That'd be great. Go for it.
One sentence definition, it would be your mind unpacked for enlightenment.
Okay. Anything else? Let's do the transparency.